It started as a detail so small that most people didn't notice it the first time. The timeline seemed clear, the sequence of events appeared complete, and everything felt like it had already been understood. But somewhere within that certainty, there was a gap. Not a large one, not something obvious enough to immediately raise alarms, but a quiet, almost invisible space where something should have been. 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes that didn't quite fit. At first, it felt insignificant. Time gets lost all the time. People forget exact moments, recordings skip, memories blur. It's easy to assume that nothing meaningful could happen in such a short span. But the more closely people looked, the more that assumption began to weaken. Because those 10 minutes weren't just missing. They were unaccounted for. And there's a difference. Missing time suggests something was lost accidentally. Unaccounted time suggests something was never fully acknowledged to begin with. And once that distinction became clear, the story began to change in a way no one expected. People went back to the beginning, retracing every step, every second leading up to the gap. Everything before it felt structured, almost too precise. Movements were clear. Actions were explained. The environment made sense. But then, suddenly the timeline slipped. And when it picked back up again, something felt different. Subtly different. Not enough to immediately identify, but enough to feel. That's when the questions began to surface. What happened during those 10 minutes? Not what could have happened, but what actually did. Because the absence of information created a space where anything could exist. And that possibility alone was enough to shift the entire narrative. Some believed it was nothing more than a technical issue. A recording gap. A simple oversight. But others weren't convinced. Because if it were just a mistake, why did everything before and after feel so carefully aligned? Why did the missing time sit exactly where it did, right between two moments that felt important? It didn't feel random. It felt placed. And that thought made it harder to ignore. The more people focused on it, the more those 10 minutes began to take on a presence of their own. Not visible, not audible, but felt. Like a silence in a conversation that lasts just a little too long. Like a pause that carries more weight than the words around it. Because sometimes, what isn't there says more than what is. People began analyzing everything surrounding that gap. The tone before it. The atmosphere after it. Small details that might have seemed insignificant before now felt like potential clues. A slight change in energy. A shift in behavior. The way certain moments didn't quite connect as smoothly as they should have. It was subtle, but it was there. And once seen, it couldn't be ignored. Some started to imagine what those 10 minutes could hold. Not wildly, not unrealistically, but carefully. Trying to stay grounded, while still acknowledging that something within that space remained unknown. Because 10 minutes is not nothing. 10 minutes is enough time for something to begin. Enough time for something to change. Enough time for something to happen that could alter everything that comes after. And that is what made it so unsettling. Because whatever existed within those 10 minutes didn't just disappear. It carried forward, shaping everything that followed, even if no one could clearly define how. That's when the story began to feel incomplete in a deeper way. Not just because of the missing time, but because of what that missing time represented. It wasn't just a gap in minutes. It was a gap in understanding. A piece of the story that refused to reveal itself, yet continued to influence everything around it. People began to ask different questions. Not just what happened, but why wasn't it explained? Because gaps can be filled. Mistakes can be corrected. But silence, intentional silence, is something else entirely. It suggests a choice. A decision not to include something. Not to show something. Not to say something. And that possibility made the 10 minutes feel heavier. Because if it wasn't an accident, then it meant those 10 minutes existed for a reason. And that reason was unknown. There were moments, brief and almost unnoticeable, where it felt like the timeline itself resisted being fully understood. As if trying to piece it together too precisely only made it feel more uncertain. Like something just out of reach, something that almost makes sense but never fully does. And within that uncertainty, the 10 minutes remained. Unchanged, unexplained, unresolved. People returned to them again and again, not because they expected immediate answers, but because the absence itself had become meaningful. It wasn't just about filling the gap anymore. It was about understanding why the gap existed in the first place. Because stories don't usually leave out parts without a reason. And when they do, those parts often matter the most. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing that a piece of time exists, but cannot be fully accessed. It creates a sense of incompleteness that lingers, a feeling that something important is just beyond reach, waiting to be understood, but never quite revealing itself. And maybe that's what makes these 10 minutes so powerful. Not what they contain, but what they withhold. Because in that silence, in that unspoken space, there is a possibility, a presence, that continues to shape how everything is seen. The timeline moves forward. The story continues. But those 10 minutes remain exactly where they have always been. Right in the middle of everything. Waiting. And the more those 10 minutes were revisited, the less they felt like a simple gap, and the more they began to feel like a boundary. Something separating two versions of the same story. Everything before it carried a certain rhythm, a kind of natural flow that made sense. Everything after it didn't feel wrong, but it didn't feel the same either. It was as if something had shifted in a way that couldn't be directly seen, only sensed. People started paying closer attention to what came immediately after the missing time. Not just the actions, but the tone, the atmosphere, the almost invisible details that often go unnoticed. And that's when something subtle began to stand out. There was a hesitation. Not obvious, not dramatic, but present. A slight pause where there shouldn't have been one. A moment where things didn't connect as smoothly as expected. The kind of pause that feels like someone is catching up, not physically but mentally. As if something had just happened that required a moment to process. And that feeling made those 10 minutes heavier than ever. Because it suggested that whatever existed in that gap didn't just disappear. It left something behind. Something that carried over. Something that changed the flow. And once that idea took hold, the story could no longer be seen the same way again. People began to ask not just what happened during those 10 minutes, but what effect those minutes had on everything that followed. Because if nothing had happened, then nothing should have changed. But something had. Even if it was only slight. Even if it was only felt. That was enough. Some viewers began pointing out how certain movements after the gap felt more controlled, more deliberate, as if there was an awareness that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not panic, just awareness. A quiet shift in presence that was difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore once noticed. Others focused on the environment itself. The way the space seemed to hold a different kind of stillness, as if the atmosphere had changed in a way that cameras couldn't fully capture. A silence that didn't feel empty, but filled with something unspoken. And then there were those who noticed something even more unsettling. The way certain details after the 10 minutes seemed almost too aligned, too composed, as if the moment had been reset, not physically, but in how it was presented. As if whatever had happened in that missing time had been left behind, intentionally or otherwise, and the story had simply continued forward without it. But the absence remained, and the absence spoke. Because the more people tried to move past those 10 minutes, the more they found themselves pulled back into them. Not because they wanted to speculate wildly, but because the gap itself demanded attention. It sat there, quiet but powerful, refusing to blend into the rest of the timeline. It stood out. Not visibly, but undeniably. And then came a thought that changed everything again. What if those 10 minutes weren't just missing? What if they were removed? Not necessarily in a deliberate, calculated way, but in a way that left no trace behind. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a clean break in the timeline that forced everything to continue without it. That idea didn't come from evidence. It came from feeling. From the sense that the story as it exists carries a weight that doesn't fully match what is shown. Like something important has been taken out, leaving behind a version that feels complete on the surface, but incomplete underneath. And that is where the tension truly lives. Not in what is seen, but in what is absent. Because absence creates space. And space invites questions. Questions that don't fade. Questions that grow stronger the longer they remain unanswered. People began to revisit older details again, looking for anything that might connect to those 10 minutes. A sound that didn't match. A movement that seemed slightly out of place. A moment that felt disconnected from everything around it. Not to prove anything, but to understand. Because understanding feels just within reach, but never quite there. And that is what makes it so compelling. Because every time the timeline is reviewed, those 10 minutes remain exactly the same. Unchanged, unfilled, unexplained. And yet, they continue to shape everything around them. Like a shadow that isn't directly seen, but affects the way light falls on everything else. Like a silence that isn't heard, but changes the way words are understood. They exist. Not visibly, but undeniably. And maybe that's why they feel so important. Because deep down, there is a sense that those 10 minutes hold something more than just lost time. They hold a moment, a shift, a piece of truth that has not yet found its way into the story as it is known. And until it does, if it ever does, the story will continue to carry that absence with it. Quietly, persistently, unresolved. So the next time you revisit the timeline, don't just watch what is shown. Pay attention to what isn't. Because sometimes, the most important part of any story is not what you see, but what was never shown. If this kind of deep, suspenseful mystery keeps you thinking long after the story ends, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to Midnight in Seoul and stay connected, because there are more stories like this. Stories that don't just reveal details, but make you question what's still hidden. And trust me, the next piece of this puzzle might be closer than you think.